Alright, so in this video we're going to go through the definitions for After Effects. We're just going to start at the top and work our way through them. Some of these will bunch together. Okay, so 3D, 2D, and 2.5D. So let's jump to After Effects. And this is a 2D layer. If I click on it, I can move it up and down, left and right. If I go to rotate, I can rotate it this direction, or if I go to position, I can move it left and right, up and down, but there is no depth. There's no 3D. If I jump over to my 3D app, this is 3D. I can spin around, I can move, I can see inside these things, outside these things. There's definite substance and geometry to them. There's a X, a Y, and a Z, so as I move something, I can move it in 3 different axes here. Same thing with rotation, and same thing with scale. Okay. After Effects also has a 2.5D world, which means that we can have things that are flat yet move in a 3D fashion. So like this is just a flat box or flat planes that I just kind of position to look like they're 3D, but it's not. So After Effects, we call it 2.5D. So it's kind of like a fake 3D environment. Adjustment layer allows us to adjust multiple layers. So inside here I have dog coughing. I have a couple layers here. This is a piece of text and then a solid behind it. And I added an adjustment layer from here, and then anything I do the adjustment layer happens to everything below it. So I've added this hue and saturation, which means that as I crank up the settings on this, the whole thing updates. And then if I were to animate that top one, then I'm animating all of them. So it's a nice way to be able to take, one effect and apply it to a whole bunch of layers at once. An alpha channel is something that's used to carry transparency between programs. This is a project I have from a 3D scene. Let me just actually put that back there. There we go. If I go to alpha, I can see this white mask. The white is what comes over from the other software, so that if I want to put a different background on it, it actually has that transparency so that I can see straight through it. So here it is without that, here it is with it. If I didn't have that alpha channel, then I wouldn't be able to change the background as easily as I can right now. An animatic is just a rough storyboard just to give you an idea of timing. We go here. This is an animatic for Toy Story. It's more than just a storyboard. It's an animated storyboard. So they would take something like this and they actually animate the characters with audio and some other stuff just to get a feel for how the show is going to happen. Bit depth is a number of data which can be stored, typically for images, movies, that kind of thing. If you have 1 bit, you basically have black or white. 2 bits, you have this many colors. 3 bits, you have that. So the more colors you have, the more bits you have, the more range that you have. Typically in After Effects, if I go to my info here and I move my mouse over it, you can see that this number is going to go up here from 0 to 255. There's really white areas. If I change this project setting to 16-bit, which is what the files I brought in actually are, as I move my mouse over this, there it goes, it's going to go up to a lot higher values, okay? And that's important because I may have some other values in here that will let me play more inside my scene. So really nice to be able to do that kind of thing. And then there's also a 32-bit, which is even more data. Bug is a small graphic in the corner used to identify a channel. So these are the typical ones you would see: ABC, NBC, National Geographic, and Disney Channel. Those are just little animations so you know what channel you're watching. Bumper is just a short thing that plays between shows just to say, hey, you're watching this, or coming up is this. Just short, little brief 5-10 second animations that play, while you're watching one show. A channel is the individual part which makes up an image. So I already mentioned alpha channel, which is right there. Let me turn off that background layer. But there's also the red channel. Here's the green channel. Here's the blue channel. And depending on what you're doing, you may actually use the red, green, and blue channel to get, more information out there. Or you may tweak some of the red, green, and blue channels to get certain kinds of effects. Cineware is a plugin that allows you to work between Cinema 4D and After Effects. So in this file here, I actually have a piece of text with a light and a solid. Now this was actually done inside of Cinema 4D. Here is my Cinema 4D file. And using a new Maxon Cinema 4D file, I was able to bring in the cameras and the lights. And so when I hit play, the background image that I have here and the text and the game station, they're all moving in the same fashion. They're all kind of like spinning around using that same camera. And there's other effects you can do too inside the scene. So it's very helpful to be able to incorporate or mix those 2D elements and 3D elements together. A codec is a software which compresses or decompresses images. So if you have video, images, audio, typically you have this format. It gets compressed and then it gets restored. So that codec is what codes it and then decodes it. So it's coding it here to compress it and then decoding it to uncompress it. If you have something that's lossless, typically you're not going to lose any quality, so it doesn't shrink it down as much. But if you have something that's lossy, it's going to lose a lot of data and then be restored. And you'll see that the original size here is exactly the same, but the original size and restored here are different because you've lost data. Collapsing transformation allows you to interact with layers inside of compositions. If I go there. So here is a composition that I have, this little animation of this word hello kind of coming onto the screen like this. I'm actually going to push it off the screen. There it goes. Okay, so it goes off the screen. Now if I go to this other composition, you'll see it animates the exact same way. It just gets cut off. But if I click this collapse transformation button, it'll actually bring the entire thing on there. It ignores the fact that in the other layer it's cut off, and it brings it right into the scene. So that was collapse transformations, and color grading is a way for us to choose what we want our coloring to look like. So this is the original video. It's taking a second to update. There it is. And then that's it with the color grading. So typically, like in movies or any of our animations, one of the steps that we'll typically do is at the end kind of color grade and bring everything together so it looks a little bit more blended. Composition is just the area we're working in. So when we're inside of After Effects, we make a composition, and then these settings are basically the settings for the video that we're going to be using. Continuously rasterize. Let's jump back to our example here with the hello. Now you can see that this gets bigger, but let's say it got really huge, like enormously huge. Put that in the middle, scale this up like crazy. And okay. So you'll see that it is pretty crystal clear right here, and that's fine. But now let's say that we brought in an Illustrator piece of artwork. Yes. Actually, I'm going here. Oops. I'm going to go into that hello comp. I'm going to drag down my Illustrator artwork. Where did I just put it? There it is. I'm bringing it again. Okay, so you can see how grainy this is, and that looks pretty gross. When I go into my other one, because this is brought in from another program, it doesn't know what to do with these pixels, so it's just like, all right, I'm just going to stretch it out. When we click on that same button, so the same collapse transformation is continuously rasterize, it basically goes through and just rereads those pixels. There we go. And do it on that layer as well. And now you can see it comes in crystal clear. Okay. So that's what that continuously rasterize is going to do, is continuously rasterize those vector images. If you had a Photoshop image, it wouldn't do anything. All right, now this next one is easing. So as this animation plays out, it's playing back at, right now it's real time, but as it starts off the animation, it starts off pretty slow, and then it hits this part where it's going faster, and then it starts to slow down again. So this is easing out here and easing in there. And if I were to go here and just reset these, we would have a even speed happening on these. Okay, typically we want easing on our stuff because it makes it look more natural. An expression is just a mini program used to help an animation. So on this, the color changes that are happening here, instead of me going through and setting keyframes, I actually wrote little expressions on the hue and on the saturation that automatically goes through and adjusts those color settings. Now the benefit of that is that I could very quickly just change a couple things here, and then that would change how that animation plays out. So now it's a little bit softer, a little bit subtler than it was before. If I had keyframes for all those, then I have to go through and redo all my keyframes. So expressions are very helpful when you can use them. Footage is just a video or image sequence. This animation here is an animation of a rendering done in 3D. It's playing back a lot slower than it should be, but there it goes. You can see it moving here. This is basically just a piece of footage. If you had a video, that would also be footage. Frames per second is the number of frames in 1 second. Whenever you make a composition, you're telling After Effects, all right, stop. You're telling After Effects how many frames are in each second. And then when we come down here into the timeline and we look, we can see, okay, here's, this is a 30 frame per second animation here. So here's 29, 30 frames. Okay, so 30 frames goes into 1 second. So if you had 100 frames in a second, you could pack a lot more animation into that second, but you'd have a lot more frames that you're dealing with. Okay, so that's what that frames per second means. An ident is just a short little thing that you would see for a channel. So you're watching the Disney Channel kind of thing, one of those, a History Channel. So just let you know which channel you're watching, just a little quick animation that typically would play out as you're watching the channel. In and out point specifies the start and end of a clip. So it could be a layer, it could be a whatever. So here is my hello. Okay, so if I wanted this to start here, I could set an in point by using Alt left bracket and go to the end and set an out point, and I've just cropped that. So now I have an in point and an out point on this thing. Same thing with footage. If I only need a certain piece of the footage, I can go through and let's say double click it and set the in point and set the out point, and automatically crop that piece of footage. A key, don't confuse this with a keyframe, but it's basically the way that we would be able to cut out a portion of an image. So in this case, I think I have way too many things open up there. Maybe that's it. I don't know. Close that. There we go. In this case, this piece of video had a green screen on it, and what I did was I added a key, and the keyer extracts the green and allows me to put another image in its place. So I have this image underneath, which is this checkerboard, and it's just basically like laying on top of there. Okay. A keyframe is what we use to animate. So whenever I'm animating something, these things down here, those are keyframes, and we need at least 2 keyframes to animate anything. A lens flare is something we use to emulate what happens in a camera. I'm going to make a solid here. And under Effect, under No Light Factory, this is one of the plugins that the college has. It might take a second to load, but these are all lens flares that I could utilize. All right, took a second to load, but there it is. So there's the lens flare. And typically you use these for special kind of effects. You don't use it on everything or every item. The Light Factory is pretty sweet compared to just the basic ones that After Effects and Photoshop have. I go here. These are basically like the same three that Photoshop has always had. Okay, they're pretty disgusting. So yeah, I don't like to use those, and I believe that's why it's happening. I think I never reset this back to 8 or saved it. So now it might play back a little bit quicker because I'm in less frames per second, or less bit depth. Linear workflow is a way that we would work with 3D layers. And this one, typically if you're just doing motion graphics, it's not a huge deal. Linear workflow. But sometimes when you render stuff out from 3D, it might come in like really washed out, and then we need to correct it, or vice versa. It might come really dark and we need to brighten it up. And it basically goes into the fact that when you do calculations, your computer is sometimes calculating with not the right math. So this is typically like what we see on the screen, is we're losing a lot of these, like there's a lot of the black areas here and a lot of the white areas here. But we don't have a whole lot happening in this area, or a lot, the coloring isn't as good as it should be. So what the computers do is that they compensate by auto-correcting it with this gamma, and then we get this straight line. So basically, it's a way for us to correct the coloring coming from a 3D image. It's become less of an issue in the past couple years, just because they've been able to handle it better. But it's just something you need to be aware of. Okay. Sometimes you'll pick a red in a 3D program, and then when you take it out, it won't be red. It'll be like a pinkish color. A lower third is just the graphic at the bottom of a screen. So one of these types of things you would see. And they're all animated and repurposed. A mask is similar to a matte, except it's typically drawn with a pen tool. So if I'm in my color grading here, and I decided I want to cut a portion of this out, I could go into my mask or my pen tool with the layer selected, and I could just draw a mask around this person. Okay, so now I've just masked off, their head if I was going to do something different with it. And I could just delete that. And then a matte, it's similar to a mask, except this is basically the black and white image. So an alpha channel on something, let me go to my game station here, and turn off all this stuff, and just look at the game station. And I'll just reset this back to where he was. There he is. So if I look at this, this is the alpha channel. But this, if I were to render out just this black and white image here, that could be considered a matte. Or if I rendered it out as completely black and then yellow, that would also be considered a matte. Because it's a way for me to isolate certain areas. Inside of this layer, actually, if I go to my 3D channel, and I go to Extractor, and click, I can pull out some of these different items that are inside here. And go here. So this one right here is an object identifier, and this is basically just like color mats all blended together. So I'm able to extract each one of these and adjust the coloring on each one of those from my 3D app. So if I did want the buttons to be a different color, or the screen, or the station itself, I could do that as well. Motion blur is what happens when items move fast in front of a camera. This hello comp, you can see it's kind of fuzzy as it comes up, but then when it stops moving, oops, let me pull it up here. When it stops moving, it's like clear. And that's motion blur. If I turn that off, you'll see that it's very clear the entire time, and it looks funky. It doesn't look right. having that motion blur on there makes it feel faster, makes it feel a bit more realistic. Onion skinning is something typically you would see in like frame-by-frame animation, but it's a way for us to see past frames. Onion skinning, there it is. Come on. There we go. So if you're trying to do like, okay, here's where my character is in this frame, and then here's where he is here, and here's where he is there, and here's where he is there. When I get to this frame, I still want to see what those other frames are looking like so I can make sure everything's lined up. Same thing with like this type of thing here. Seeing where those past frames are definitely helps you out. Okay. Parallax is something that happens as items move closer and further from the camera. Alright, so in this example I have these numbers here, and they basically look like they're just different scales and kind of like stacked on top of each other. But the 4s are actually really far in the back, and the 1s are very close. And as I take this camera and I move it left and right, you can see how the 1s are moving different than the 4s are. Because the 4s are closer, they're going to be moving a lot faster. Now the 2s and the 3s look like they're moving at about the same pace. Depending on how big of a movement I would have or big of a space I have between these is how far it's going to move. So the number 4s are at basically 12,000, and the 3s are at 1,000. So if I push the 3s back further to like, let's say 6,000, I push the 2s forward a little bit, then as I start to move this camera, you'll see a lot more difference between the 1s, the 2s, the 3s, and the 4s. So that's called parallax, and it's something that happens in the real world, just how we see things. And how our eyes work with items further from our viewpoint and closer. Parenting is just linking items together. So After Effects is going to save. So when we deal with items inside here, if I were to duplicate this layer, as I move one layer, the other layer doesn't move. But if I parent one layer to the other, then when I grab one layer, it'll move both. And as I rotate one layer, it'll rotate both. And as I scale one layer, it'll scale both of those. Okay. Now this one still moves independent, but this one, if I grab it, it grabs both of those pieces. Okay. And pick whip was how I did that. So anytime you see this little whip icon right here, that's called pick whipping. So I use a pick whip to grab that item, and that just connects those items together. Now in this case, I've actually connected the position and the scale, and I'm going to deconnect that one. So if I scale one up, it's actually going to move the position up of that. So if I move this, it'll move it, but if I scale it, it'll also move it. Okay. So you can basically pick whip anything to anything that has the same kind of values. Even like to one value, I could just pick whip just to that. So lots of abilities when you get into some of these advanced things. Presets are ways that we can do an animation and then save it. If I go to my Hello comp, I grab this animation here. I set this to, get out of the way. Easy ease. I can go under my animation and I can save a preset, and then I can come back later and pull that preset back up, which is a neat thing to be able to do. If you find an animation, you're like, I'm always going to be doing this on pieces of text, you can save it and reuse it over and over again. Raster is basically when we bring an image from Photoshop. Okay, when we looked at that continuously rasterize button, that was bringing in a vector and rasterizing it. Okay, anything we bring in After Effects is going to be rasterized because it's just that's how it is. Eventually, we'll end up with pixels. But while we're in the software, if it is vector, we can display it as a vector and use it as a vector. But if it's pixels, it's pixels. Real-time preview. So typically, when you hit play, you want to see this back at real time. So now I've just hit the play button, and it's not playing back at real time. It's actually going incredibly slow. Okay, so it doesn't help me out if I'm trying to time something or get something to see if it's flowing nicely. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that I have a lot of things open, and After Effects could use a little bit of a reboot probably. But with this green bar here, that's giving me my real time. It's showing, okay, everything's loaded. This is playing back at real time. The simpler your stuff is, the more likely it is to play back at real time quicker without having to load. Our render queue is basically where our stuff goes to render. This is media encoder. Here's my game station. This is the queue. I could load 2, 3, 4, 5 things in here. I could duplicate these and change the settings. So if I wanted one to be H.264, one to be a sequence, I could do that as well. Okay. Typically, when you render anything, it has to go into a queue, just like your print queue, and then it can be set up. Our resolution is the number of frames left and right, up and down. So under our comp settings, there's our resolution, 960 by 540. Rotoscoping is a way that we would use masks to cut things out. So if we didn't have something from 3D that was masked, alpha, vignetted, whatever, we would have to go through frame by frame and draw masks around all the items and make sure that they flowed and moved with the character. It's a lot of work to do stuff like that, but that is a job and that somebody has to do it. We also have our title safe. So if I go here to title safe, the outside here is our action safe. The inside one is our title safe. So those are things that you have to pay attention to when you have titles or you have pieces of footage you may not want to extend past that area if it's important. Our sequence is anything we bring in that's a animation. So this game station is a rendered sequence is what we call it. It's also called a image sequence or footage way up here. Okay, but typically we would call it either one. Basically anything with a group of frames, ordered frames which flow together. Could even be like a flip book that you scanned in page by page and then brought in and used inside your animation or brought from another software. A solid in After Effects is just a solid image or a solid color. Layer, new solid, we pick a color and give it a resolution and hit OK. So one solid color. And typically we would drop effects or whatever on top of this, masks, whatever we need to. Tracking is when we try to match up one piece of footage with another. So if I go back to here, go back to key. So at the beginning of this, you can see where this checkerboard is kind of laid out. And then as it goes forward, it's kind of following the position of that. In order for me to get that to happen, I had to actually track the footage of this. I had to figure out how this was moving and apply it to that one. So that's called tracking. And it's something that the more you get into motion graphics, you may want to incorporate or have your stuff move with real-world video. Okay, so that's where tracking would come in. Transitioning is how we get from one piece to another. It can be lots of different things. Let's go back to our 2D here. I'm just going to make that huge. I'm going to duplicate it, and I'll make the bottom one a different color. There we go. Okay. So if I'm trying to get from layer 3 to layer 2, I'm going to go to Effect, way at the bottom transition. I think it's cut off on your screen. And I can pick one of these. So this is a block dissolve. So this basically dissolves the top layer so that we can see the bottom layer. And I can choose how big these blocks are. And I can choose the amount of feathering, whether it's soft edged or not. Okay, and that's just one transition. Even me going in here to opacity and animating opacity, that's still a transition. Me going from here to there is still a transition. It's how I get from one piece to the next piece. Trapcode is a set of plugins. Typically, people in the industry, they try to use whatever they have on hand. But if you have a set of plugins that you could buy or should learn, Trapcode is the one. There's so many different things that it has inside here, and so many different cool effects that you can do with these. So I would definitely recommend utilizing that so you at least have an understanding of it. Vector is just an image from Illustrator. So when we draw paths in Illustrator, that comes in as a vector image. A vignette is just a darkening of the edges and a lightening of the center. Typically we'll see this in videos, movies, that kind of thing, where you have this like darkness around here and then our focus gets drawn right to that center area. Okay, same thing here, same thing there. You see it like all over the place. And then finally work area, and this is just where we're working at. So as we're in our hello comp, with the work area all the way up, when we hit play, it plays, and then we basically have nothing that's happening in here. So we can set our work area just to what we're working on, and that way we can loop just that area, not have to worry about this other 4 seconds of nothing happening here. Okay, so those are our definitions. Definitely not the only things you need to know in After Effects, but these are the key things that should get you a good foothold on your skills. So watch it. Make sure you understand what we're talking about.